She stood blind and alone at the altar, until a stranger walked in and changed everything. What he did next, no one saw coming. The morning sun bathed the small chapel in Lexington, Kentucky, in a golden light, but the air was cold and heavy with silence. Guests shifted uncomfortably in the pews. Some glanced at their watches. Others avoided looking at the altar, where a young woman stood completely still. Her name was Elora Mabel Windrow, 27 years old, blind since birth. Today was supposed to be her wedding day. She wore a flowing ivory gown with lace sleeves that draped gently over her pale skin. Her long chestnut hair had been curled and pinned back with delicate white roses. A soft smile had once played on her lips that morning, when her bridesmaids whispered how beautiful she looked. But now, that smile had faded. She clutched a bouquet of white lilies with trembling hands. The minutes ticked by. 10, 15, 20. No footsteps, no music, no groom. Whispers began to fill the chapel. Do you think something happened? He's probably just running late. Or he changed his mind. The priest cleared his throat, unsure whether to speak. The bridesmaids exchanged anxious glances, one of them subtly pulling out her phone. A few guests had already started to stand, ready to leave. But Elora stood still, her face turned gently toward the altar, as if she could see the future she had hoped for. She didn't need her eyes to feel the tension in the room, or the pity that hung in the air like thick fog. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She knew. Deep down, she already knew. She spoke, barely above a whisper. He's not coming, is he? No one answered, and yet in that moment of unbearable silence, someone unexpected had already entered the back of the chapel. Someone who had seen everything. And he was walking toward her, slowly, deliberately, as if fate had just rewritten the ending. Declan Stewart Hayes had no intention of attending a wedding that day. He had arrived in Lexington 3 days earlier, escaping the suffocating pressure of New York's financial world. A self-made billionaire at 39, Declan was known on Wall Street as the cold strategist. Sharp, decisive, unreachable. But those who truly knew him, if any still existed, would have said that the walls he built around his heart were born from years of betrayal, not arrogance. He had come to Kentucky not for business, but to breathe. That morning, after a restless night in his hotel room, he took a long walk through the quiet downtown streets. Something about the peacefulness calmed him. As he passed the old stone chapel, he heard the faint sound of a pipe organ. The music didn't pull him in, but the rawness of it did. There was no celebration in the notes. They sounded like goodbye. Curious, Declan stepped inside, quietly taking a seat at the back. He noticed her immediately. The blind bride stood completely alone at the altar, her face tilted upward, as if waiting for light that would never come. Her dress was simple but elegant, and her posture, despite the tragedy unfolding around her, was full of quiet dignity. Declan didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he knew what it felt like to be left alone, in a moment meant to define your life. The guests had started to murmur again. He could feel their discomfort. Most were more embarrassed for themselves than for her. A few had the decency to look guilty, but no one moved. No one did anything. Declan leaned over to the elderly woman beside him, her face creased with sympathy. "Who is she?" he asked in a low voice. "Elora Windrow," she whispered. "Blind since birth. Raised in a foster home just outside town. Sweet girl. Good heart. Been planning this wedding for over a year." He was supposed to be the one who finally saw her for who she is. Declan's jaw tightened. "And the groom?" "Cole Drummond," the woman replied with a sigh. "Rich family. Local businessman. Not as decent as folks thought, I guess." Declan said nothing more. But something inside him shifted. He rose from his seat slowly, his polished shoes echoing against the wooden floor as he walked down the center aisle. Guests turned to stare, some whispering, others frozen with confusion. Even the priest took a step back, uncertain of what was happening. Elora tilted her head at the sound of approaching footsteps. "Cole?" Declan stopped just before her. For a moment, he simply looked at her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with something far more human. Respect, compassion, understanding. He spoke gently. "No, I'm not Cole." Elora's fingers tightened around the bouquet. "Then, who are you?" He stepped closer and removed his suit jacket, carefully draping it over her bare shoulders. I'm just someone who couldn't watch you stand here alone. The chapel fell into a stunned silence, and then one clap, a child's hand, then another and another, until the room, filled with shame and confusion only moments before, erupted into gentle applause, not out of spectacle but solidarity. Declan didn't flinch. He didn't perform. He simply stood beside her, and in a room full of people who abandoned their courage, he offered her his. Alora's breath caught in her throat. The jacket around her shoulders was warm, smelled faintly of cedarwood and something clean, like rain. The man's voice had been unfamiliar, but steady, kind. Still, everything inside her screamed that this wasn't right. This moment had been hers, and Cole's, or it was supposed to be. She turned her face slightly toward the sound of his breathing, trying to sense him the way she had learned to navigate her world, by feel, by energy, by instinct. Why would a stranger do that? She asked softly, her voice shaking. Declan knelt slightly so they were at the same level. Because I've been where you are, he said. Not here, not in a chapel, but in that place where someone promises to be there forever, and then vanishes when you need them most. And no one deserves to be left standing alone like this. She didn't speak, but her fingers loosened around the bouquet. The tension in her shoulders eased just enough for her to breathe again. He hadn't pitied her. His words didn't sound rehearsed. There was no trace of performance in them. Behind them, the priest finally stepped forward, cautiously. Miss Windrow, would you like to reschedule the ceremony? Elora gave a short, breathless laugh. You mean, try again? With someone who didn't show up the first time? Her voice was bitter, but not cruel. Declan turned to the priest. I think she deserves a proper exit. The old man blinked, unsure how to respond. Declan extended a hand toward Elora. May I walk you out? Elora hesitated for a moment. Then, slowly, she reached out. Her hand touched his. His palm was firm, but his grip was gentle, like someone holding something fragile, but not broken. As they turned to walk back down the aisle, silence followed them at first. Then, little by little, it was replaced by a soft, respectful applause. No one quite knew what they were clapping for. Courage, maybe. Dignity. The fact that she held her head high despite the shattered dream at her feet. They reached the chapel doors, and Declan leaned in close. There's a bench just outside under the trees, he said quietly. Would you sit with me for a few minutes? Elora nodded. They stepped outside. The cold air touched her skin, like a reminder that the world was still real, still moving. Declan guided her gently to the bench. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer cliches like, you'll find someone else, or everything happens for a reason. He just sat beside her, silent but present. After a long moment, she spoke again. You must think I'm pathetic. He turned his head sharply. Not even for a second. Everyone in there was waiting for something to fall apart, she said, her voice tight, and I gave them the show. Declan looked out at the leafless trees, his hands folded loosely in his lap. No, he said. You gave them something real. You stood there. You didn't run. That's more strength than most people will ever have. Elora tilted her head toward him, her cloudy gray eyes searching through the darkness. Who are you? She asked again. My name is Declan Hayes, he said simply. She tasted the name in her mind. It didn't mean anything yet, but something in her chest had shifted, subtle, like the beginning of a thaw. I'm Elora. I know. They sat in silence again, not awkward, not heavy, just still. And for the first time that day, Elora didn't feel abandoned. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Declan didn't vanish like most strangers would. He didn't hover either. He called once the day after the wedding that wasn't and asked if she wanted some company for a walk. She said yes before she could overthink it. That first walk was slow. He picked her up from her apartment on the west side of town, a modest second-floor unit in a creaky old building with no elevator. She came down with her white cane, dressed simply in jeans and a knit sweater. He didn't touch her arm unless she asked. He didn't guide her like a child. He walked beside her like an equal. They strolled through the park near the river, where she used to go with Cole during better days. Only this time, the silence wasn't filled with tension or expectations. It was just quiet and safe. How do you know when someone's really there for you? She asked suddenly, halfway through their loop around the lake. Declan glanced sideways at her. What do you mean? I mean, how do you really know? When you can't see their eyes or read their face? When you have to guess? He paused before answering. You stop listening to what they say, he said at last, and you watch what they do. Or in your case, maybe you feel it. Elora smiled a little at that. I guess I'm still learning how. They met again the next day, and the day after that. Sometimes they walked. Other times they just sat in her small kitchen, drinking coffee and talking about everything but the wedding. She told him how she'd gone blind before she ever had a memory of sight, how her mother had died of an overdose, and her father had disappeared before she was born. Foster homes, institutions, teachers who ignored her, people who spoke louder as if that would help. But she didn't tell it like a sob story. She told it like someone who had learned to fight without fists, someone who survived. Declan never interrupted. He never turned her into a charity case. Instead, he told her about his own mess, about growing up in Chicago, about watching his father lose everything in a rigged business deal, about clawing his way into finance, about betrayal after betrayal in a world where love was transactional and people had price tags. He told her how lonely wealth could be. How does a man with more money than God end up sitting in a chapel in Kentucky? She asked one night, smiling over her cup of tea. I didn't want to be found, he said, but I found you. Elora didn't answer that, but her silence was full of meaning. Weeks passed. The town moved on. Gossip faded. Cole Drummond never came back. There were whispers that he'd fled to Florida or gotten someone else pregnant. Elora stopped caring. With Declan's help, she focused on something new, her future. He encouraged her to restart the massage therapy classes she'd dropped after Cole convinced her she'd never find clients. He drove her to the center 3 times a week and waited in the car with a book. He even helped her convert the second bedroom in her apartment into a mini studio, complete with an adjustable table, speakers, and soft lighting. Now, you really think I can do this? She asked him one night as he hung blackout curtains. He didn't hesitate. Elora, you already are doing it. You just needed someone to remind you. Something began to shift between them. Unspoken, unforced, a kind of gravity. She didn't flinch when he brushed her hand now. He didn't look away when she turned her face toward his. Still, neither of them spoke the words that hovered in the air. Not yet. They weren't ready. But for the first time in a long time, Elora didn't feel like a woman left behind at an altar. She felt like a woman finally walking towards something real. One rainy afternoon, as drops tapped gently against her window, Elora sat curled on the couch with a thick knitted blanket, listening to the soft hum of a jazz record. Declan had just left after bringing her groceries. He insisted she stay dry, and the apartment smelled like cinnamon and roasted coffee from the bakery bag he'd left behind. But something about the quiet today felt different. Maybe it was because she'd finally allowed herself to feel safe. Or maybe it was because, for the first time since the failed wedding, she no longer saw herself as someone who had been abandoned. That part of her was healing. Still, the past didn't let go so easily. Later that evening, she called Declan. I need to tell you something, she said, voice low, as he answered on the second ring. I'm listening, he replied instantly. She took a long breath. It's about Cole. Declan was silent, waiting, not pushing. He wasn't always like that, she began. When I met him, he was kind, or maybe he just knew how to pretend really well. He'd come to the center where I volunteered. He was helping with donations. We talked for hours. He told me I was brave, strong, that he'd never met anyone like me. She paused. Declan stayed quiet. I didn't know what love looked like. I never had a model for it. No parents, no steady foster family. So when someone said the right words, I believed them. He made me feel seen, even though I couldn't see him. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. But then things changed slowly. After we got engaged, he became impatient. He didn't want me working anymore. Said I should just be taken care of. He'd get irritated when I asked to hear something again or when I didn't react to facial expressions. He said I was lucky he was with me. Declan's voice came, calm but firm. That's not love, Elora. I know, she said quietly, but I didn't want to believe it. I thought if I just gave more, loved harder, he'd stay. She swallowed. And then, 2 nights before the wedding, he asked me if my parents had left me anything. A trust, insurance, something. I told him the truth. My birth parents were addicts. I had nothing. I heard the silence in his voice after that. Declan felt heat rise in his chest, the kind of rage that came only from witnessing cruelty disguised as affection. The next morning, he was gone. No note, just silence. I thought it was my fault, she whispered, that I wasn't enough, that if I could see, maybe he'd have stayed. Declan didn't speak for a long moment. Then, quietly, you were too much for him, Alora. Not too little. Too real. Too honest. Too brave. She smiled faintly, blinking away tears. You say things like that, and I almost believe them. He answered, without hesitation, one day, you won't just believe them. You'll know them. A pause passed between them, gentle, full of unsaid things. Declan, she said after a while. Yes, I want to know what you look like. His voice softened. You will. She tilted her head. Promise? I promise. She could almost picture him smiling on the other end of the line. Strong jaw, tired eyes, maybe a little scar near the temple, something life gave him early. She didn't know. But she was starting to trust the world again because of him. She hung up with a strange feeling in her chest. Not longing, not sorrow. Hope, the kind that comes quietly without fireworks. The kind that builds slowly, one honest word at a time. Spring arrived gently in Lexington, wrapping the town in blooming dogwoods and the faint scent of honeysuckle. Alora felt the warmth on her skin, and with it came a shift in her soul, like her heart was thawing after a long winter. One Saturday morning, Declan knocked on her door earlier than usual. She opened it with a curious smile. You're early, she said. I've got something to show you, he replied, his voice holding that rare note of excitement she was beginning to recognize. She tilted her head. Is this going to be another walk in the park, or are you secretly leading me to a hot air balloon? No balloons, he chuckled, but bring your cane, and trust me. She didn't need to pack anything, just herself, and trust him. Something that no longer felt difficult. They drove in his car, always the same one, an old dark green Land Rover that rumbled like it had secrets. He didn't say where they were going. He just played soft music and asked her about her latest class. After about 30 minutes, they stopped. She heard gravel under the tires, then birdsong, loud and clear, like they were far from the city. Declan got out, came around, and opened her door. All right, he said, offering his hand, come with me. She took it and stepped out. He guided her slowly over what felt like a dirt path. Then the grass beneath her feet softened. The air smelled clean, untouched. No exhaust fumes, no concrete. Then he stopped. We're here. Alora took a breath. Where? Declan turned her gently toward the sound of rushing water in the distance. This land, he said, is mine. I bought it last year thinking I'd eventually build a retreat here. Something quiet, peaceful. But now, I think it could be something else. She listened, feeling the wind press gently against her cheeks. There was openness around her. Trees swayed above. Birds chirped high up in the canopy. I wanted you to feel it, he continued, because I'm going to build your clinic here, a real one, with everything you need. Private rooms, sensory lighting, adaptive tools. You'll own it. I'll just help you get started. Alora froze. She turned toward the sound of his voice, stunned. Declan, why would you do that? His answer was soft but immediate. Because you heal people. And this world needs more of that. And because I believe in you. More than anyone ever has. Her throat tightened. She stepped forward, and instead of fumbling, she found his chest. Her hands touched his shirt, warm under her fingertips. She let her palms rest there. You keep doing this, she said, half laughing through the emotion. You keep showing up. I told you, he said, placing his hands gently over hers. I'm not going anywhere. Then, with the wind blowing between them and the trees whispering around them, he did something that startled her. He knelt. Alora, he said, his voice low, reverent. You don't have to answer now. I don't even know if it's too soon. But this moment is the most certain I've ever felt in my life. Her heart pounded. I want to spend the rest of my days beside you, he said. Not to rescue you, not to fix you, but to walk with you, to build something that's ours. Silence stretched between them, deep and golden. Then, Elora whispered. Yes. Declan looked up. She smiled. You don't have to wait for an answer. It's yes. They didn't kiss right away. They just held each other, as the trees stood witness and the wind carried their quiet joy into the open sky. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, Elora felt entirely chosen. 1 week before the wedding, Declan arrived at Elora's apartment with something in his hand, a slim folder, sealed, official-looking. His face was calm, but there was something unreadable behind his eyes. Elora, sitting at her small kitchen table listening to an audiobook, turned toward him as soon as she heard the door close. You're late, she teased. I know, he said softly. I had to sign some papers. He walked over and sat across from her, placing the folder between them. She could hear the faint crackle of the envelope, the way his fingertips lingered on it. What's that? She asked, brushing her hand toward the sound. Something I didn't want to do without your blessing, he replied. But I already did it, because I had to. Elora smiled faintly. That's a confusing introduction. He exhaled. It's a surgery, vision restoration. The room went silent. The air seemed to still. What? She said after a moment, barely able to form the word. I found a team in Boston, a world-class ophthalmologist. They specialize in cases like yours. Congenital blindness, complete retinal detachment. It's experimental, high risk, but there's a chance, a real one. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. You're saying I could see? I'm saying you might, he said gently. And if there's a chance, even the smallest one, I want you to have it. She shook her head slowly, overwhelmed. Declan, I've spent my whole life not seeing. I've adapted. I'm not broken. I know you're not, he said quickly. This isn't about fixing you. You're perfect exactly the way you are. But if the only reason you'd say no is fear, then let me be the one who's brave for you. Just this once. Tears filled her eyes. She reached across the table, and he met her halfway, their hands locking. Why? She whispered. Why would you do something this big for me? He leaned closer. Because I want you to have everything. And because if there's even a tiny chance you'll one day be able to look into my eyes and see how much I love you, I'd give anything for that. That night, Elora didn't sleep. She lay in bed with her hands over her eyes, trying to imagine what colors looked like, what Declan's face might be. She'd never let herself dream about that. Not really. But now, it was here. 3 days later, she was on a flight to Boston. Declan never left her side. The surgery lasted over 7 hours. They warned her the recovery would be long and uncertain. She'd need to keep her eyes bandaged for several days. Even then, vision might come in flashes, light, shadows, shapes, or nothing at all, no guarantees. In the sterile hospital room, Declan sat beside her bed holding her hand, his voice the only thing grounding her in the endless dark. I'm here, he'd whisper. Every step, no matter what. The morning they removed the bandages, she was shaking. Her heart thundered as the doctor slowly unwound the gauze, layer by layer, until only a sliver of fabric remained. And then, a burst of light. It was blinding, disorienting, painful even. But it was something. She gasped, flinching. Declan squeezed her hand. Are you okay? He asked. She blinked. Once, twice. Shapes danced before her. Colors bled into one another. And then, a face. Blurry at first, edges soft. But she could make out dark eyes, a strong jaw. Lines of worry and hope etched into a face she had only imagined before. Declan? His eyes filled with tears. He nodded, speechless. You're... She laughed, a broken sound. You're beautiful. He laughed through the tears and pressed her hand to his lips. And for the first time in her life, Elora saw the world. Not just the room or the man in front of her, but the truth of it all. That love had brought her to this moment. Not perfection, not rescue, just love. And a man who refused to let her stand alone ever again. The day of their wedding dawned soft and golden, the sky washed in gentle pastels. Light filtered through the windows of a small countryside chapel, surrounded by fields just outside Lexington. No cathedral, no grand ballroom, just a quiet, beautiful space, peaceful, like everything they had built together. Elora stood in front of a full-length mirror inside the chapel's modest bridal room. For the first time in her life, she was seeing herself as a bride. Her gown shimmered faintly in the morning light. layers of soft ivory tulle floating around her like mist. Her chestnut hair had been swept up with delicate pearl pins, a few loose strands framing her face. She turned slowly, her fingertips grazing the fabric, not quite believing any of it was real. Her reflection stared back at her, not just as a woman who had been left once, but as someone reborn, someone who had survived, healed, and dared to love again. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," she said, turning toward the sound. It was Declan's sister, Maris, smiling warmly. "It's time." Elora took one last breath and stepped out. Guests were already seated inside the chapel. Many of them unfamiliar faces, others familiar and dear. Her classmates from massage therapy school, her favorite clients from the center, the baker who always gave her an extra croissant, even the elderly woman from the failed wedding day, sitting in the front row, beaming like a proud aunt. But Elora saw only one face as she stepped through the doorway. Declan stood at the altar, dressed in a classic gray suit, no tie. Simple, elegant, just like him. He wasn't smiling with arrogance or perfection. He looked overwhelmed, humbled, as if the sight of her had stolen the breath from his lungs. Her heart thudded as she walked, step by step, down the aisle. She didn't need a cane. She didn't need help. She was walking toward her future. As she reached him, he held out his hand. She placed hers in it without hesitation. "You're glowing," he whispered, eyes locked on hers. "And you," she replied with a soft smile, "are everything I never thought I'd find." The ceremony was quiet, intimate. When the officiant asked if they would love and cherish one another, their answers came not as declarations, but as truths they'd already lived. The vows they spoke weren't about promises in the future. They were acknowledgments of what had already carried them here: honesty, resilience, and something deeper than luck. When it came time for Elora to speak, she paused, eyes shining. "I once stood alone at an altar," she said, voice steady, "and I thought my story ended there. But sometimes, the end is just the start of something better. You found me when I was invisible to the world, and you saw everything. Not what I lacked, but what I was. You gave me space to be whole, to choose for myself, to see, not just with my eyes, but with my heart. I am not just marrying you. I am becoming myself beside you." Tears slipped down Declan's face as he whispered, "I love you." "And I love you," she replied. When they kissed, it wasn't dramatic or staged. It was full of relief, of gratitude, of peace. Outside the chapel, under the canopy of spring leaves, the celebration was simple. No loud music, no glittering chandeliers, just good food, laughter, children playing on the grass, and the occasional clink of glasses. Later, as the sun dipped low, Declan and Elora slipped away from the crowd and walked through the meadow behind the chapel. Fireflies began to flicker. The world had softened again. Declan stopped, taking her hands in his. "Still want to build that clinic?" he asked with a grin. "More than ever," she said. "And what else?" Elora leaned into him. "A life, a home, maybe, someday, a family." He kissed her forehead, pulling her close. As the stars began to pierce the evening sky, Elora rested her head on his chest, hearing the beat of the heart that had walked into a chapel for no reason and given her every reason to believe in love again. They stood there, wrapped in the kind of quiet only true love knows. And this time she wasn't standing alone. She was exactly where she was meant to be. In a world that often glorifies flashy love stories and instant connections, Elora and Declan's story is a quiet reminder that real love isn't loud. It's consistent, patient, and brave. It's not about grand gestures or perfect timing. It's about two imperfect people who choose each other, again and again, even in the face of pain, fear, and the scars of the past. Elora's journey isn't just about finding love. It's about reclaiming her worth. She begins as a woman who doubts her value because of how others have treated her, and ends as a woman who sees, literally and metaphorically, not only the world around her, but herself, clearly for the first time. And Declan, a man who had everything except connection, learns that vulnerability is not weakness. It's the key to real intimacy. I think this story matters because it shows that love doesn't save us, but it walks beside us while we save ourselves. It's not about who left you at the altar. It's about who walks toward you when everyone else walks away. And that, to me, is what true love really looks like.